When my daughter looked me straight in the eye and let words fall like a cold blade, "Mom, go find somewhere to die. You're useless now." My heart felt like it exploded in my chest. I am Gloria Mitchell, a woman who spent her whole life nurturing, sacrificing, and protecting her family, and suddenly I had become useless clutter in my own home on Capitol Hill, Washington, D.C. 3 days after my husband's death, I was forced out of the house I'd lived in for more than 4 decades, clutching 2 hastily packed suitcases and a small box of old photographs. My daughter, Tiffany, the woman I once trusted without question, not only threw me out, she announced that everything from the old townhouse to the tens of millions in investments belonged to her. In her eyes, I was no longer her mother. I was an obstacle from the past standing in the way of her ascent. I wandered to a cheap motel in Anacostia, sat on a sagging bed, and stared at the stained wall, swallowing my shame. And there, amid the wheeze of the air conditioner and the smell of mildew, a detail came back to me that Tiffany hadn't counted on. My husband, Harold Mitchell, was never careless. He was meticulous with every legal document, every contract, and most of all, his will. 3 days later, I sat in Michael Donovan's law office in downtown Washington, D.C., and the truth that unfolded turned everything upside down. The daughter who thought she was clever, powerful, and had every piece on the board turned out to be the foolish one. In the game my husband left behind, the sacrificial pawn, me, would become the queen. The little church on C Street, just a few blocks from Capitol Hill, was so cold that morning my breath turned to mist. I stood beside Harold's walnut casket, my hand still remembering the warmth of the man who had held my hand for 43 years. The church bell kept time. The organ hummed softly. The smell of candles, of wood, of my old wool sweater, they blended together into a morning that was hard to swallow. Tiffany arrived half an hour late, striding in like she was walking straight into a press conference. A tight black dress, hair perfect in a neat chignon, oversized sunglasses hiding her eyes, or hiding whatever she didn't want anyone to see. Derek was beside her, suit perfectly cut, the polite smile of a man used to bending opinion with words. They hugged me the way the successful hug the defeated, by the book, at the right length, without an extra second. "Mom, I know this is hard," Tiffany whispered into my ear. Her perfume was strong enough to drown the scent of candles. "But everything will be fine. I already talked with Derek. We'll take care of everything, take care." That phrase stuck in my throat. Why would my husband's death need to be taken care of? I nodded along. At that moment, my grief was still a blunt, heavy thing like the pews in the church, not yet shaped into suspicion. After the eulogy, an old friend of Harold's spoke about the man he'd been while working for the federal government, honest to a fault, the kind of man who would return, found change. I had loved him for that, for his simple decency. But that day, when Tiffany squeezed my shoulder again and flashed a look at Derek, I felt like I was on stage instead of at a graveside. Somewhere in the dim corners of the church, a local photographer's camera flashed. Tiffany didn't avoid the lens. She smiled. That afternoon, the townhouse on E Street felt artificially quiet. Family photos lined the staircase, each step a slice of time. Tiffany on graduation day, Harold at an awards ceremony, and me in the middle of them, always the one who stitched the gaps together. I made a pot of chicken soup like I always did when Harold was under the weather. My hands moved, but my mind was empty. Setting the ladle down, I realized I'd prepared 2 extra bowls. Habit, the truest and cruelest form of loyalty. That evening, Tiffany came by without knocking. "Mom, Derek and I have talked," she said, businesslike. "This house is too big for you. The stairs are dangerous, the heater is old, the neighbors are loud. I've set up tours at 2 places that are very suitable for seniors, lots of activities. You won't be lonely." "Lonely," I echoed, tasting the word on my tongue. "You think I'm lonely?" "Of course," Derek interrupted, opening his briefcase to pull out a glossy stack of brochures. "They have reading rooms, yoga classes, outings, shuttle service. And the finances are reasonable for whom?" I asked. They smiled, but the smiles didn't reach their eyes. The next days became a string of to-dos that Tiffany organized like a PR campaign. Cancel services, clear rooms, box things up. I watched my daughter move through the kitchen like a producer, inventorying, directing, ticking boxes. Each cardboard thump sounded raw in my ears, as if she were packing up pieces of my life into categories labeled completed. By the 6th week after the funeral, Tiffany blurted out a line I would remember more for the echo it left than for the words themselves. "Mom, Derek and I have decided," she said, standing straight in front of the fireplace where Harold used to hang his coat. "We're moving in. This house suits our family better. As for you, you should move to somewhere safe and convenient." Something inside my chest shattered, not at the decision itself, but at the way she said it. There was no pause, no room for me to step in. Derek dragged a suitcase into the living room like a prop in a performance. "We'll cover the initial costs," he said, patting his wallet like a philanthropist remembering an envelope. "You'll be fine." "This house," I said, my hand flat on the polished wood of the cabinet Harold had sanded smooth over summers, "is where your father came home every night. It's where you blew out your 16th birthday candle and cried over a torn dress. It's where—" I stopped. At the far end of the room, Tiffany wasn't looking at me. She was checking her watch. "Mom," she said, her voice softer by half a beat, "according to Dad's will, everything is in my name. I've let you stay out of kindness, but now I need to get my life in order." I stood very still. Tiffany's words hung in the air, dropping to the hardwood floor and shattering like glass. I thought of Harold, the man who signed everything in front of me, read every document twice, put originals in the safe, copies in binders, labeled everything with tidy stickers. I remembered a winter evening 6 months ago when he'd put his arms around me at the kitchen sink and said, "I tightened up a few documents so it's less of a mess." Don't worry, I was worried, but not the way Tiffany meant. 2 hours later, I was in the back parking lot with my 2 suitcases. Tiffany stood on the stoop while Derek lifted my things into the trunk. "I'll transfer some money to you," Tiffany said, handing me a few small bills like a tip to a server. "In a few days, when the bank finishes the paperwork." "How many days?" I asked. "Soon," she replied, and for the first time that day, she looked me straight in the eye. "Mom, don't make things harder." Hard. I let out a short, bitter laugh. The difficulty Tiffany warned about was about her, not me. That night, Anacostia was damp in the way I'd hated since I was young. The damp of a wheezing air conditioner, of long-hanging curtains, of an apologetic motel carpet. I set my suitcases down and sat on the sagging edge of the bed, listening to the highway hum in the distance. The refrigerator sighed. My heart beat. Then, amid all those sounds, a memory switched on as clear as a light. Harold's calloused hand, warm on the back of my neck, his steady voice. "I will never let you get lost in a forest of papers." A forest of papers. I opened my old phone. My fingers moved slowly, not because I was frail, but because I wanted to be sure I was still steering the story of my own life. I scrolled to a name I hadn't dialed in ages, Renee Carter, the lawyer Harold called when he needed a cool head and a sharp pen. My first message was as simple as the life I'd lived. "Renee, this is Gloria Mitchell. I need to see you." Tomorrow morning, as early as possible, I set the phone down and leaned my head against the wall, letting the grief recede like a tide. What remains after the tide pulls back is never a smooth beach. It is jagged shale, sharp rocks, and broken shells edged like knives. But it is also a reminder that the shoreline still exists. Even if someone thinks they can redraw it with a single paper called The will. Tomorrow, I will return to the city. I will walk into Renee's glass front office, sit in a leather chair, and ask her one short question. Where is the real will? And if the answer matches the feeling wedged inside me, then Tiffany's little cleanup campaign will have only just begun, and she will no longer be directing it. I returned to the little house in East Portland, where the streetlights flickered against peeling paint, the roof leaked, and the windows whispered with the wind. It wasn't a chandelier-lit place like the Pearl District, but at least it was mine. I hung Calvin's old coat on the chair and had barely sat down when the phone rang. The name on the screen, Madeline. I knew nothing good would come from that call, but I answered anyway. Her voice came sweet and fake enough to make my skin crawl. Loretta, tonight's misunderstanding is nothing. My parents have certain standards for Christmas. You understand, right? Our party needs a certain refinement. Your soul food, well, it might make our guests uncomfortable. I tightened my grip on the phone. Those dishes, fried chicken, cornbread, collard greens, were the soul of my family. Memories of Calvin, the pride of the black community around here. Yet in Madeline's mouth, they became something that would cause embarrassment. Madeline, I said slowly, forcing a calm tone, my son grew up on those dishes and was proud of them. Now, just because your parents are coming, he should be ashamed? She paused for a beat, then replied with a thin laugh, "Oh, don't overthink it. This isn't about race. This is about class." My chest tightened. Those two words, class, landed like a hammer. I had spent my life bent over hard work, selling plate after plate of fried chicken, saving every pension dollar to give Anthony a home he could be proud of. I'd poured Calvin's life insurance and mortgaged this old house so my son and daughter-in-law could raise their heads in a posh neighborhood. And yet, in their eyes, I wasn't classy enough to cross their threshold. I said nothing more and quietly hung up. No shouting, no crying, just sitting in the dark kitchen, listening to my heart race. But inside, one truth rang clear. If I kept paying for that house, I was complicit in the humiliation they kept throwing at me. I opened the drawer and pulled out a stack of bank statements. The numbers glared back. $2,800 each month, on the dot, for 5 years, never once missed. More than $200,000 had left my pocket, and all I got back was contempt. I stared at those figures and realized I had nurtured their arrogance with my own blood and sweat. That night I called the bank. The clerk's voice over the line was neutral, unaware that my life was turning. "We see an automatic transfer of $2,800 monthly to the Whitmore account. Would you like to cancel it now?" I looked around the old kitchen, the fridge whining, the flaking walls no one would fix, Calvin's coat still hanging on the chair like it waited for its owner to come home. I took a deep breath. Yes, cancel it immediately. When the call ended, the room fell silent. But this silence wasn't heavy anymore. It felt like someone had thrown open a window and let the light in. I sat there in the dark and, for the first time in years, felt that I was no longer a shadow in their house. I was no longer a puppet jerked around by talk of class. I had reclaimed myself. The next morning I put on my old gray wool coat and wrapped the scarf Harold had given me in the winter of 1998 around my neck. The scarf was worn thin, but it still felt strangely warm. I left the Sunset Inn and caught the 30N bus straight into downtown D.C. The city that morning was a muted gray. The glass towers reflected heavy clouds. I sat by the window and watched the blocks slide past, my heart beating in time with the bus. Michael Donovan's office was in a marble building near DuPont Circle, a polished brass plaque, a heavy mahogany frame around the door. I stepped inside, and my shoes squeaked softly on the marble floor. The blonde secretary with thin-rimmed glasses looked up. "Mrs. Mitchell, Mr. Donovan is expecting you." The office door opened to a cozy room lined with bookshelves, the smell of oak mixed with old paper. Michael Donovan, in his 70s, tall and thin, with a shock of silver hair, stood and greeted me. His eyes were equal parts surprised and kindly. "Gloria, you finally made it. I've called your house several times, but Tiffany always said you were traveling, that you weren't available." I froze. Traveling? So my daughter had put up a curtain of lies. I sat in the leather chair opposite his desk, clutching my scarf. "Mr. Donovan," I said, forcing myself to stay calm, "I need to know the truth. What did Harold leave in his will? Tiffany says everything belongs to her." Donovan's face tightened, then flushed with anger. He opened a cabinet, took out a thick file, and set it on the desk with a decisive thud. "Gloria, I witnessed Harold sign his final will just 6 months before he passed. And remember this, Harold was always extremely careful. This is the original. It's notarized, witnessed, and cannot be forged." My hand trembled as I saw Harold's familiar signature, his neat, measured handwriting, just like the man himself. Donovan flipped through the pages, his voice slow and firm. "He bequeathed you the Capitol Hill townhouse, all of the household furnishings, and 70% of his financial assets, roughly $23 million. The remaining $10 million goes to Tiffany. But," Donovan emphasized, his eyes flashing behind his metal frames, "that $10 million is held in trust and will only be distributed when Tiffany turns 45, contingent on one condition. She must treat you with respect and dignity after his death." The room fell silent. I could even hear the tick of the wall clock. My heart hammered. A condition. Harold had anticipated this. Somehow he had seen this possibility, Tiffany's cruelty and greed, and had built a shield for me. I exhaled sharply. So, Tiffany didn't just lie. She violated the conditions of the will? Donovan nodded, his expression grave. "Exactly. And that means that $10 million will revert to you. Gloria, you're not inheriting $23 million. You're inheriting $33 million, along with the house and all related assets." I covered my mouth, tears spilling out. It felt like an electric shock coursing through me, bewildering and illuminating at once. All the humiliation at the motel, Tiffany's cold stares, the cutting words she'd thrown at me, suddenly they spun back as their own condemnation. Donovan leaned forward. "Gloria, what Tiffany did is more than deceit. It's fraud and elder abuse. Forging a will or concealing legal documents are serious crimes. We can call the police today." I wiped my tears and clenched my fist. In my mind, I saw Tiffany on the front step, eyes hard as she said, "Mom, go find somewhere to die." I had trembled before at those words. Now I felt only a furnace of resolve in my chest. "Mr. Donovan," I said, my voice steel, "do whatever is necessary. It's time my daughter learned that she isn't the only one who knows how to move the pieces on this board." Donovan nodded and gave a small, wry smile. "Good. Then we begin. I'll call a friend at the D.C. Police Department. You are not alone anymore, Gloria." I sat there with midday light pouring through the window, striking the thick file on the desk. In that moment, I understood. The shame at the Sunset Inn was only the overture. The real game started now, and this time I would be the one holding the pieces. From Donovan's office, we didn't leave right away. He was on the phone nonstop. Police, the prosecutor, even a team of financial experts. The oak desk in front of me became a command center. Donovan called it Operation Justice. A detective named Rodriguez arrived. Solid build, direct gaze. He listened to Donovan, then turned to me. "Mrs. Gloria, what your daughter and son-in-law have done amounts to federal fraud. Forging a will and concealing inheritance information can land them years in prison." I nodded, my hand trembling slightly, but my voice firmer than before. "I don't want revenge. I want justice. Not just for me, but for everyone who's been looked down on by their own family." Rodriguez offered a small smile, as if acknowledging the strength that had risen in this silver-haired woman. That afternoon, the banks froze every account in Tiffany's and Derek's names. Their credit cards were immediately declined. I pictured Tiffany swiping a card at some luxury boutique and watching her face go white when it was rejected. The thought made me breathe out for the first time in weeks. A real breath. At exactly 3:47 p.m., my phone rang. The screen read Tiffany. I let it ring a few times before answering. Mom? What's going on? The bank says the accounts are frozen. Do you know anything? Her voice came fast, panicked. I answered slowly. Yes, I do, Tiffany. I'm sitting in Donovan's office. He just read me your father's real will. You remember Donovan, don't you? The man who helped your father buy the Capitol Hill house? There was silence on the other end for a few seconds. Tiffany then forced a calm tone. Mom, you must be mistaken. I was only trying to protect you. These procedures are complicated. You wouldn't understand. I tightened my grip on the receiver and closed my eyes, my voice dropping low. You threw me out of the house, Tiffany. You gave me $200 and told me to go find somewhere to die. Is that what you call protecting me? On the line, Tiffany's voice changed, softening into pleading desperation. Mom, please, don't make this worse. I was wrong, but I'm still your daughter. Can we talk? At home, like before? I heard Donovan clear his throat. A reminder, don't be manipulated. I breathed in and spoke plainly. We'll meet again, Tiffany, but not at home. In court. That night, sitting back in that shabby motel, a strange feeling took hold. It wasn't just pain or anger anymore. It was a slow, steady belief. I was entering a new chapter. Harold had prepared for me. Donovan was fighting at my side, and justice was turning its back on Tiffany. In the mirror, the silver-haired woman, her eyes still rimmed with sleeplessness, looked back. Beneath the fatigue, there was a new light, a light I surprised myself to see, the light of power. Tomorrow, the police would issue the arrest warrant, and I, the mother who had once been dismissed as useless, would be the first witness. The next evening, it was drizzling in Washington, D.C. Pennsylvania Avenue shimmered with the glow of streetlights. I sat in Donovan's office with Detective Rodriguez. The three of us watched the wall clock intently. A report came in. Tiffany and Derek were dining at Le Diplomate, the upscale French restaurant they frequented. Ironically, it was the very place Harold had once promised to take me for our 40th anniversary, before work always got in the way. Rodriguez pressed the phone to his ear. His voice clipped. We're ready. Our team is in position. I closed my eyes and pictured Tiffany in a designer dress, lifting a glass of Bordeaux, convinced that tomorrow everything would be fine and that the old fool mother could never turn the game around. A few minutes later, Donovan's phone rang. Rodriguez listened, then nodded and allowed himself a small smile. It's done. They were arrested right at their table, in front of friends and colleagues. No denying it. The image played in my head like a film. Two plainclothes officers approaching, their voices ringing out above the clinking cutlery. Tiffany Hayes and Derek Hayes, you are under arrest for fraud, forging a will, elder abuse, and conspiracy to unlawfully seize assets. The entire restaurant froze. Tiffany dropped her glass. Red wine spread across the white tablecloth like a stain. Derek lunged up, shouting, but within seconds his wrist was bent behind him and cold handcuffs bit into his skin. Tiffany screamed, "This is a mistake! I'm the legal heir! I have the papers!" Rodriguez replied, voice as cold as ice. "Forged documents have no legal value. And your principal witness is your mother, the woman you cast out with $200. A murmur rippled through the room. Curious, scornful, gleeful eyes turned toward them. Friends and colleagues who had once buttered them up now pretended not to notice. At the same moment, my phone buzzed. Rodriguez had sent a photo. Tiffany's face ashen, mascara streaked, hands cuffed. Derek bowed his head, being led out into the rain. Under the police lights, everything looked stark and exposed. I stared at that photo for a long time. A part of me ached. She was, after all, the child I had carried and raised. But another part, a stronger part, whispered, "This is justice. This is the price of betrayal." That night, for the first time in weeks, I returned to the Capitol Hill townhouse. The familiar oak door swung open. The scent of wood and dried lavender from the old vase still lingered. I stood in the living room and flipped on every light. The house was bright and warm. I set my suitcase down and looked around, a feeling both strange and familiar rising in me. This was no longer Harold's house or Tiffany's house. This was my home. I sank into the sofa and opened a bottle Harold had kept. After a small sip, I whispered to myself, "Harold, you planned farther ahead than I ever imagined. The game you set in motion. I finally know how to play it, and this time, I'm the one giving checkmate." 2 days after Tiffany and Derek were arrested, the jail sent me an envelope. The handwriting on the outside was scrawled, but instantly recognizable. Tiffany. I sat at the oak table in the townhouse and, hands trembling, opened the letter. "Mom, I was wrong. I was greedy and panicked, but I am still your daughter. Please don't let this go any further. I promise I'll make amends. I'll change. Please, think of the grandchildren." I folded the letter closed. The words were familiar, the same pleading she'd used as a child to get me to forgive her. But this time, the memory that came back was crystal clear. Tiffany standing on the stoop, her eyes ice cold as she said, "Mom, go find somewhere to die." That afternoon, Donovan took a call from Derek's lawyer. After several exchanges, I was put on the line. For the first time, his voice was no longer arrogant. "Mrs. Gloria, we all want this settled quietly. Let's keep it civil. Tiffany and I will return the assets, set up a fund in Harold's name, so long as you withdraw your complaint." I gave a bitter little smile. "You call that goodwill? It's a bribe, and you forget. I am not afraid anymore." That night, while sorting through Harold's study, I found a hidden drawer. Inside was a thick packet bound with rubber bands. When I opened it, my heart dropped. Transfer ledgers, consulting contracts, accounts in the Caymans and Delaware, everything pointed to shell companies. I called Donovan. He was at my house within the hour. His silver hair trembled as he flipped through the pages. "Gloria, this is more than irregular. Harold appears to have been involved in money laundering for at least 10 years. This is evidence, not speculation." I pushed back from the desk as if the floor had fallen away. The man I'd lived with for 43 years, the man who'd told me he'd never let me get lost in a forest of papers, had been the architect of that maze. Donovan was quiet for a moment, then said, "We need to contact the FBI. If Tiffany and Derek learn about these documents, they'll use them to bargain. Gloria, you have to move first, before they corner you." The next morning, at Donovan's office, an FBI agent arrived. Sarah Martinez. Upright, stern-eyed, her voice steady. "Mrs. Sullivan, we've been tracking a money laundering network for years. The files you've brought suggest Harold Mitchell could be a key link." I breathed sharply. "You mean Harold committed crimes?" Martinez looked at me, her expression softening briefly. "We haven't reached a conclusion. But the paperwork shows he participated in suspicious transactions. The important thing is, Tiffany and Derek appear to have discovered this. They may be trying to contact federal prosecutors to trade information for leniency." Donovan cut in. "If that's the case, Gloria must come forward. You hold the legal will and you have those files." Martinez nodded. "Exactly. If you cooperate proactively, the FBI can protect you. But be prepared. Much of the estate could be seized if it's determined to be proceeds of criminal activity." I looked down at the table, my hands tightening around Harold's scarf. Inside me, two conflicts twisted. The shattered pain of discovering the man I loved was not the man I thought he was, and the resolve not to let Tiffany and Derek weaponize his crimes to buy their freedom. Martinez leaned in, voice firm. "Mrs. Gloria, the question now isn't only what Harold did, it's which side you choose, conceal or reveal. Remember, Tiffany and Derek won't hesitate to sell anyone out to save themselves." I drew a long breath. It was time to answer, not just for the FBI, but for myself. 3 days later, I was sitting in Donovan's small conference room. On the table, Sarah Martinez set down a tiny device the size of a shirt button. She looked at me, calm but stern. "Mrs. Mitchell," she said, "to break Tiffany and Derek's bargaining position, we need direct evidence. You'll wear a wire to record your entire conversation with them. The moment they make an offer or mention using Harold's secrets in exchange for leniency, we'll have the basis to charge them." I put my hand to my chest, where the device was about to be attached to my sweater. My hand trembled. "What if they discover it?" I asked. Martinez answered bluntly, "We'll be less than a block away. Just say, 'It's too cold in here,' and we'll move in." I swallowed hard. Weeks earlier, I had slept on a sagging motel bed, clutching a box of family photos and crying until my voice went hoarse. Now I was about to face my daughter, not as a helpless mother, but as bait in an FBI operation. That evening, Tiffany and Derek were allowed to meet me in the townhouse's small parlor. Of course, the whole thing was under the agent's control. They walked in, dressed as if they'd just left a finance conference. Tiffany forced a smile. Her eyes were red from lack of sleep. "Mom, I know you're angry, but we can work this out. Dad, he wasn't as clean as you thought. It's complicated. Derek found proof. If you cooperate, the family keeps at least $5 million in this house. If you don't, the FBI will take everything. Then you'll have nothing either." I sat up straight, trying to hide my quickening breath. "And what exactly do you want in return for cooperation?" Derek set a leather briefcase on the table, opened it, and inside was a pre-printed agreement. "We agree that Harold engaged in illegal conduct, but for the sake of the family, you will not oppose this. In return, we guarantee you keep the clean portion." This is the only way I looked him in the eye, forcing calm. "You call that protecting the family? Or is it extorting an old woman you threw out on the street?" The room was tense as a drawn wire. Tiffany cut in, her voice shaking but pleading. "Mom, please. Don't make this into a scandal. Think of the grandchildren. They need you more than you think." I placed my hand against my chest and felt the tiny microphone recording every word. I knew Agent Martinez was listening somewhere out there. Then, at that moment, I looked straight at Tiffany. "Daughter," I said, "you're right about one thing. There are things far more complicated than I thought, and the most complicated thing is that you don't know who your father really was." Tiffany froze, her lips trembling. What are you saying?" I leaned forward and lowered my voice. "You think Dad was just a money launderer? You're wrong. He worked with the FBI for more than a decade. All those files, they were traps for greedy people." Tiffany's mouth fell open. Derek snapped the briefcase shut, his face gone pale. At the same time, we heard footsteps pounding in the hall. The door burst open. Sarah Martinez and 2 agents rushed in, guns drawn, voices commanding. "Tiffany Hayes and Derek Hayes, you are under arrest for conspiracy to extort, federal fraud, and knowingly using confidential information for personal gain." The briefcase was ripped from Derek's hands. Tiffany slumped into a chair, hands over her face, sobbing, "No, this can't be true." I sat still, feeling an electric current hum through my veins. Tonight the board didn't just flip, it ended in checkmate, and I was the one who delivered the final move. After Tiffany and Derek were led away in handcuffs, my townhouse fell into a heavy silence. I sat motionless, the clinking of metal cuffs echoing like a triumphant fanfare of justice. Then, Agent Sarah Martinez turned to me, calm, but with a grave look in her eyes. Mrs. Gloria, it's time you know the whole truth about Harold. My heart clenched. I nodded. Sarah placed a thick file in front of me, the classified seal removed from the cover. For more than 12 years, Harold wasn't merely involved with suspicious money flows. He was an informant, a confidential source for the FBI. We allowed him to participate in parts of the laundering operation to build his cover. Every document, every invoice was monitored by us. The information he provided helped bring down nearly 50 members of the Torino crime family and dismantle a network worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I went numb. Countless sleepless nights spent doubting my husband, the disorienting minutes seeing strange contracts. All of it flipped into an unimaginable truth. Harold had led a double life, but not to betray me, to protect our family and this country. Sarah continued, her voice precise. He was permitted to retain a portion of the funds as lawful compensation. In other words, the $33 million Tiffany and Derek tried to seize is entirely legitimate. You no longer have to fear forfeiture. Tears streamed down my face. Pain and relief braided together. I whispered softly, "Harold, you planned so far ahead. Even in death, you were protecting me." Sarah put a hand on my shoulder. "One more thing. Tiffany and Derek's attempt to exploit Harold's files to extort your mother will go into the federal record. This is a textbook case of elder financial abuse. Your story could become a powerful voice to help others escape being exploited by their own family." I drew a long breath. Instead of hatred, something else was growing inside me, a mission. I realized what happened to me was not only about making me stronger, but could let me stand up for the vulnerable. "Then I will speak," I said. "I will tell this story, not to humiliate my daughter, but so other mothers, other elders, know they are not alone." Sarah nodded, and for the first time I saw a smile on her usually stern face. That is how Harold would want you to live on, turning pain into power. That night, when the house settled into quiet, I sat in Harold's study. No more secret files, no heavy darkness, only the familiar scent of oak and the warm glow of the desk lamp. I spread out an old photograph on the desk, Harold and me standing before the townhouse the day we moved to Capitol Hill, his arm around me, his gentle smile. I set the photo down and whispered, "Rest now, Harold. The game you started. I have played the final move." Outside the window, Capitol Hill's lights cut into the night sky, bright as a witness to the truth. And in my heart, for the first time after so many dark days, a steady belief rose. Justice did not only find me, it would ripple outward to help many others. 3 months after the arrests, my life had changed so much that even I could hardly believe it. The house on C Street, once only echoing with arguments and cold silence, was now filled with light and the laughter of new friends, volunteer lawyers, social activists, and older women who came to me to share their stories. On my desk, a stack of letters from the federal prison sat piled high. Tiffany had written me 17 times. The first letter was full of tears and remorse. The 13th was full of arguments, trying to convince me she had only been protecting her father's legacy. But by the 17th, the tone had changed completely, short and urgent. "Mom, I know there are no words that can erase what I did. But please give me a chance to see the children. They need you, and I have nothing left but that hope." I read it over and over, my heart torn. A part of me, the mother who had once held Tiffany through fevers and stitched her first prom dress, wanted to open up, but another part, the woman who had just crawled out of hell, understood that easy forgiveness could turn justice into a joke. I placed the letter in the drawer and locked it. "Not now," I whispered. "If you want to atone, it will take deeds, not ink on a page." Meanwhile, my new foundation, the Gloria Mitchell Foundation for Elder Protection, officially launched. With $15 million from the legally held portion of the estate, We opened a 24/7 hotline and hired a team of attorneys specializing in family financial abuse. At the opening ceremony, I stood on a wooden podium before dozens of reporters and women with silver hair leaning on canes, and my voice rang out. The day my daughter threw me out of my home, I thought I had lost everything. But that day, I learned this. When you stop letting others decide your value, you will find true strength. Today, I want that strength to be given to everyone who has been demeaned, whose voice has been stolen because of their age. The room erupted in applause. An elderly woman cried and whispered, "Finally, someone speaks for us." That night, I returned to the painting room. Harold's old study now hung with my oil paintings. I put a new portrait on the easel, not of Harold, not of Tiffany, but of a silver-haired woman standing tall, holding a lamp, with the silhouettes of thousands of elders stepping out of the dark behind her. I smiled. I might not be able to save my relationship with my daughter, but I was saving thousands of other daughters and sons by forcing them to see the true worth of their mothers and fathers. Outside, Washington, D.C. lit up. This townhouse was no longer just Harold's house or Tiffany's house. It had become a symbol of resilience, and I knew my journey was not over. It had only just begun. I used to think the end of my story would look like quiet rooms and smaller dreams. Instead, it taught me one brutal, beautiful lesson. Losing everything can be the first step to finding who you really are. I came into the light not because someone handed me a victory, but because I chose to stand up, ask the right questions, and refuse to be erased. This isn't only my story. It's a warning and a promise. A warning that love and blood don't automatically mean safety, and a promise that when people use power to prey on the vulnerable, there are ways to fight back. I turned my pain into action. A foundation, a hotline, a voice that says, "You are not invisible." That's the true victory. If this story moved you, tell someone who needs to hear it. Protect your parents, read the documents, ask uncomfortable questions. And if you're the one who's been pushed aside, know this: you can come back. You can rebuild. Justice isn't always immediate, but when it comes, it changes everything. Thank you for listening. Take care of each other